Welcome back, Chappelle. All right, so we got into a lot of stuff today, right? We reviewed the early onset of Napoleon pretty heavily, right? And then we got into his biggest liberal accomplishments, like his having the largest empire since Rome, and then creating the lycée system, which is his public school system, creating a system of merit-based promotion through the government, creating the Napoleonic Code as well, right? Selling the Louisiana Territory. Massive important events that went down underneath the reign of Napoleon. Now, let me make sure I'm recording real fast. It's very embarrassing to sit here and talk to a computer screen and absolutely no one hears the entire thing. All right, so now, anyway, but really, really quick though, the big thing is, the Napoleonic Code was great, okay? It was awesome, and it got spread all over the entire continent of Europe, right? So it was amazing because the Napoleonic Code was great, and it completely codified all the laws and put it into a simple system of property ownership and declare that all men are equal, right? They have freedom to religion, they have a freedom of speech, they have a freedom of, several freedoms that are, entitled to them that they are born with. But, it was very mean to women, right? So this is another example of how Napoleon could be wildly liberal and progressive, and then also very wildly negatively conservative, right? Conservatism can be a great thing when you're trying to keep things great the way that they are, right? But it can also be a negative thing in this era as trying to go backwards when reforms were actually brought forward to help people, right? So, because as we know, he wasn't the nicest outlook on women at all, and of course now teaching at an all-girls school, I feel it's very, very important to drill that home, right? Now, here's the other thing though. Where are all these great accomplishments going to end up? That's right. Good job, Eliana and Riley, all over the continent of Europe, right? Because they're spreading now through what again? Heck yeah, Fedor. Good job per tweet. Cultural diffusion, right? So all the great things that he did in France are going to end up spreading all over the continent through cultural diffusion as he goes and takes a bunch of these areas over, right? Now, he had a massive, massive rise to power. He was very, very famous. Everyone in Europe knew his name, even though a lot of people in Europe did not like him very much. But he did have three huge mistakes, right? Because as we're talking about it now, we know Napoleon ends up falling eventually, right? He did have three very, very big mistakes, and they include the continental system, the Peninsular War, and the invasion of Russia, right? So now this is supposed to have hold on one second, that's supposed to have a 2 right there. I don't know why it goes 1-1. Here we go, let's change that real quick. Come on. Oh, that's ugly, but whatever. All right, so anyway, now, view prescient. All right, there we go. Now, the Peninsular War, the continental system, and the invasion of Russia, right? These are the reasons why Napoleon ends up losing his post and falling out of the good graces of most of Europe. Now, remember who he's fighting against. He's fighting against all these coalitions, right? He's taken over the entire continent of Europe. People are scared to death of him, right? So the continental system, the Peninsular War, and the invasion of Russia are going to be the real big reasons why these coalitions were able to finally win, right? So the continental system was a very, very early attempt at Napoleon to try and, instead of using military force to cripple Britain, right, because he hates them so much, he wanted to try and use a different thing. Economics, right? So he wanted to try and choke them out by making them poor, right? He wanted to try and turn them into a very, very weak state without any funds to use by blockading the entire continent of Europe, right? So he wanted to set up why did I just hit escape? He wanted to set up a naval blockade, right? So let's really quick go over what that is, where he would place boats around the entire perimeter of Europe, right, going all the way down to the tip of Spain near the Strait of Gibraltar and then all the way up through here, right, preventing Great Britain from trading with anybody in the continent of Europe, right? Now, the problem was a lot of nations are going to ignore this, and a lot of this is due to the fact that, remember, the countries that he's taking over don't necessarily like him a lot, right? The countries he's taking over are actually resentful of the fact that the French are now their big controllers because they're not French. They're German or Austrian or Hungarian or Ukrainian or Russian or Slovakian or Bohemian, right? There are all these different people that have their own languages and their own origins and their own music and their own lifestyle, right? So it's going to lead to a big sense of nationalism in these people, right? They're going to be like, no, I don't want to be controlled by France because I'm Russia. Or I don't want to be controlled by France because I'm Italy, right? I don't want to be controlled by France because we're Austria and we're awesome, right? So many nations are going to ignore this, and they're going to trade with Britain anyway through this sense of nationalism, right? This is going to infuriate Napoleon. But also, it wasn't a great idea by Napoleon because it had too many holes in it, right? It had way too many holes in it. Because you just lost all of your boats at the Battle of Trafalgar to Admiral Nelson, right? His navy was destroyed at the Battle of Trafalgar pretty much. So he didn't have enough boats to even make this blockade effective, right? So it wasn't a good idea. He should have just let it die. He should just let everything lie. Bygones be bygones. I'll leave Britain alone and I'll continue about my way. And he might have been able to stay in power up until the day that he died, which was a really sad day. Now, anyway, but then there's the Peninsular War, right? And France is going to specifically attack Portugal for violating the continental system that he had just set up, right? Now, keep in mind, he already controlled Spain, right? He invaded Spain in, I believe, 1802 or 1803, and he actually took them over pretty effectively and put his brother Joseph in charge, right? So now Joseph Bonaparte is going to be the new king of Spain, okay? Now Portugal became what's known as a sister republic or an allied country, and then he actually said to them, you have to follow this continental system as well. But the Portuguese are going to trade with the British anyway. And then so Napoleon's going to send a massive amount of forces through Spain to attack Portugal to submit them to the continental system. But the problem is the Spanish see this as their chance to attack Napoleon back. They're like, we don't want to be ruled over by these people anymore. We don't want to be ruled over by the French anymore. So they lead a thing known as a guerrilla war, right? Guerrilla, spelled with a U-E, all right? Not with an O-R. They're not throwing like, it's not like Harambe came run out of the woods and punch somebody in the face, all right? So like that's not a guerrilla war, all right? So really, really quick though, these techniques are going to inflict massive casualties on the French military. What a guerrilla war actually is it's not following the traditional rules of engagement, right? The traditional rules of engagement stated that you must assemble in a field away from civilians. You must line up over there. I'm going to line up over here. We're going to volley back and forth at each other until we then decide to charge each other. We may have some strategies to help us win this using cavalry, flanks, pincer moves, things like that. Traditional military strategy, which Napoleon was a genius at. But he was not prepared to declare war or actually effectively guide a war that was guerrilla style, which is where people are like jumping out of the trees and shooting at you, right? That's guerrilla war, right? Violating all those rules. Going for extreme violence and trying to kill as many people as possible in like very, very sporadic attacks, right? Now, then this was his biggest mistake, right? Dude, if history has ever taught us anything, if any of you ever one day become a dictator, all right, and decide to try and take over the entire world, learn from Napoleon and learn from everybody basically throughout the entire existence of Europe. Just don't invade Russia. Like, just don't do it, all right? Like, it's a bad idea. Don't invade Russia, all right? For a lot of reasons, but they're mostly climatological, all right? So getting into it, though, Napoleon decides that they're going to then invade Russia because they also violated the continental system, right? Now, Napoleon, to do this, realizes that Russia is huge, and he's like, oh, I have read all the histories, and I am ready to go and fight the Russians, and I don't know why I sound like this. All right, so now, but he decides that he's going to go and invade Russia, so he assembles this thing known as his Grand Army, right? That's this thing down here. It was 600,000 men strong. The Grand Army was made up of conscripts, which are forced to serve military members, or conscription, right? Drafted into the military from all over the Grand Empire, right? So his Grand Army had like conscripts or soldiers from everywhere, right? But it was 600,000 men strong. Absolutely enormous, right? So as the Russian troops were realizing, oh no, we only have like 120,000. We're like massively outnumbered. They're like, but we got an idea. They're going to try and suck the French further and further in. And when Napoleon decides to start his invasion, it's in the late summer / early fall, right? So the Russians are like, we're going to just keep pulling them in, and then Russian winter will do the job for us. And they weren't wrong, right? So they used an idea to keep pulling them in, though, called scorched earth, right? So they would be right here, and then they would go up and engage them and be like, pew, 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 and then they would retreat, right? And when they were retreating, they would burn everything in their retreat to prevent the French soldiers from using it, right? So the French were now running out of food, running out of supplies, running out of goods, and getting sucked further and further and further in to Russia. This is known as scorched earth policy, right? So once they got to Moscow, the French actually went all the way to Moscow. You see the invasion of Russia path right here? Got all the way to Moscow and had several engagements where a lot of their men died, but they get all the way to Moscow and it's abandoned, right? Moscow's completely abandoned. The Russian Tsar never surrendered because they started just going towards St. Petersburg, so they hooked north and went to where it's even colder, right? And so Napoleon's like, and he has to retreat, right? And so when he retreats, he's retreating in the winter, right? So when he retreats, by the time he gets back, 590,000 of his troops had either starved, been killed in battle, or froze to death.
I'm so cold that I can use my nose drippings as a pair of chopsticks.
I'm so cold that I'm shivering.
With only 10,000, 98% of 600,000 men died, right? So now, since his forces were so greatly weakened, and also since all of these other countries were hyper-nationalist, and they were like, we don't want to be led by France anymore, and this is our chance, as he's coming back towards France, because the French would never get rid of him, but as he's coming back towards France, they jump him. And at the last coalition war by the British, the Russians, and the Prussians, well, not the last one, but the British, the Russians, and the Prussians, this coalition war is going to defeat Napoleon with this massive combined force, right? Because he only has 10,000 troops left. And so they take him, they arrest him, and then they banish him to the island of Elba under British control, right? So Napoleon was sent into exile in Elba. Right? Not in 1815, though. I think his first exile to Elba was in 1814, exile to Elba. I think it was either 1814 or 1813. Yeah, on this day in 1814, yeah. So in 1814, he was exiled to Elba, right? So that's the wrong number. So, which is a small island right off the coast of Italy, which, coalition. You're the British, the Russians, the Prussians, the Austrians, and all these other people combined. And you're telling me you couldn't have come up with a better idea than to stick him over in Italy, right? So you just put him somewhere where he's closer to France now than he was when he was born in Corsica, right? So why would you be so dumb? He's going to what? He's going to get back. He's going to leave. He's going to show back up. And he does. All right, so Napoleon escapes from Elba. And to this day, nobody knows. God, look how triumphant he is. Nobody knows how he did it. Nobody knows for sure. But I'm sure he was waiting for guard rotations, probably bribed a lot of them, right? And he ends up getting in a small boat and sailing back to France, right? And he raises a small army and becomes emperor again of France for 100 days, right? And this is known as his 100 Days campaign. And he attempts to strengthen his army, and he creates a fighting force of a small military of about 73,000, right? Then the French welcomed his return. So in the 100 Days campaign, they were like, yes, he's here, he's back. Hooray! But then all the rest of Europe was like, and so they had another big coalition force, right? And the British, the Prussians, the Russians, they meet Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo, right? Which is a small town in Belgium, and they meet him on a field. And there was when Napoleon made one of his biggest mistakes, right? He should have just charged. He didn't charge over a field with his cavalry. He waited for it to dry so the horses wouldn't have to get slowed down. But in the time where he was waiting for it to dry, the Prussians outflanked him and attacked his right. So Napoleon and his inexperienced army was completely eradicated. And he was exiled for good to the island of St. Helena, which is a small island off the South Atlantic, which is off the coast of Africa. So he's now halfway around the world, right? So they exile him into St. Helena, or Helena, however you want to say it. And he spent 6 years there, reading the newspaper and gardening, which were his two favorite things to do. And 6 years, after 6 years, he dies from stomach cancer, right? In 1821, he dies from stomach cancer. And what we believe, there's a lot of controversy that surrounds his death. A lot of people think that the British might have poisoned him and stuff like that. But he was one of the most controversial and intense figures in all of European history, right? He changed everything. Through cultural diffusion, his reforms are going to spread all over Europe and lead to more progressive societies, and he is the death toll for absolutism, right? Absolutism begins to swiftly die following Napoleon. We might as well look at European history as pre and post Napoleon. Even though we don't think he was the best person on the planet, I think he's probably one of the coolest historical figures. He's my number 2 next to Caesar, right? So that is Napoleon. That is all. I will talk to you guys tomorrow. Hope you all have a good evening.